How can you even declare yourself a sovereign nation if you can't, on a dime, close your borders and be self-sufficient?
This is Kim Iversen. She's one of the new hosts of Rising on the Hill's YouTube channel. I first heard about Kim when she was introduced by Jimmy Dore. He gave her some early popularity, but she's gotten a lot more attention recently because of her new gig. She has definitely had some controversial moments. The best being when Ryan Grim shut her down hard on the Uyghur genocide in China.
And I don't think we should shrink from our obligation, to be critical of human rights abuses that are happening anywhere on the globe.
Well, interestingly, every Muslim country minus Turkey, I believe, actually is in alignment with China.
I don't want to hear from the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia on human rights. I just don't care what they have to say about human rights. No, but I mean regarding whether or not there's an actual there's an actual ethnic cleansing going on against Muslims in China. They have their own geopolitical reasons, and pointing to the idea that, well, these people are Muslims and they say nothing bad is happening there is just not a serious inquiry into what's actually happening when we can talk to people who escaped from it.
More recently, Kim got a ton of flack from a lot of the online left when she took a very odd position on the media's portrayal of a school shooter.
Showing Crumbly as this innocent-looking angelic white kid is intended to stoke fear and support a narrative that white people, no matter how nice they look, are domestic terrorists who we should all be afraid of.
A lot of the online left now considers her a grifter of the variety that pretends to be on the left but actually spews right-wing talking points.
In 2019, Kim Iversen tweeted that the USA is one of the least racist countries and that racism is a distraction from the real issues. Now, I believe that's when she was just starting out on YouTube, and the second she got pushback, that's immediately when she began her pivot towards Dave Rubinism.
One of her nicknames is actually Kim Pool. I'm always hesitant to throw around the word grifter because it requires reading into someone's intentions, which is something that's incredibly hard to do. In Kim's case, there's very little evidence this is the case, as she's had heterodox views as long as I've been following her. She's certainly made overtures to personal liberty. She's pro-gun rights, pro-free speech, and pro-bodily autonomy, so she does have some decent instincts. She also has some terrible ones. It's funny to me how you'll have these people who believe in the right to free speech, or the freedom to own what guns you want, or freedom over your own body, and then, at the same time, ignore another kind of freedom, economic freedom. And this is where Kim Iversen gets things really wrong. She's a pretty hardcore protectionist, to the point where I would call her an economic nationalist.
How can you even declare yourself a sovereign nation if you can't, on a dime, close your borders and be self-sufficient? You have to be able to be, to some level. Basics.
We should not close our borders and be self-sufficient. The U.S. government, we would have a Suez Canal debacle every day if the U.S. government was in charge of domestic manufacturing.
Credit to Robbie Soav for pushing back against her there. I'm glad that Rising has an actual libertarian on their panel now, rather than just strawmanning that perspective like the old hosts did. And he's absolutely right about this. Attempting to manage the economy in such a way would be a disaster. But back to Kim Iversen. She thinks you should enjoy your various freedoms, but you shouldn't be free to exchange goods and services with people who live in other countries. And her rationale for why you shouldn't is, well, what if there's an emergency? Which is the oldest rhetorical trick in the book for taking away freedoms. Now, I realize that appeals to liberty don't mean much to people who don't already value it. I'm sure when I invoked economic freedom, I lost a bunch of people. I believe in freedom for its own sake, irrespective of the results. But I realize that not everyone shares those values. So, in the spirit of arguing on grounds that might actually appeal to people who don't share my priorities, let's talk about practicality. What does the economic nationalism that Kim Iversen is calling for actually look like in practice? Well, the nation that most closely adopted this "let's close our borders and make what we need in-house" is North Korea. That's a nice reminder that limiting freedoms can be used to keep people in as well. Of course, every nation is different, and the United States isn't North Korea. So naturally, autarky is going to look different here. We don't have to guess what economic nationalism would look like in the United States, as the U.S. agricultural system follows exactly these principles. And go figure, the whole thing is a grab bag of corporate welfare. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, through various powers granted to it through the Farm Bill, attempts to ensure that there is enough food grown in the United States for domestic consumption. As Daniel Imhoff writes in The Farm Bill, A Citizen's Guide, just as a strong defense is regarded as national security, a diverse and well-developed agriculture is regarded as food security. In the United States, the Department of Agriculture is charged with this dual mission: support the creation of an abundant food food supply, and ensure that all citizens receive basic nutrition. Imhoff is not exaggerating here. This is precisely the argument Florida Senator Marco Rubio made in favor of import quotas and subsidies for the sugar industry. Rubio said that he would only vote for getting rid of these things if the countries that export sugar into the United States get rid of theirs as well. And here's why. Otherwise, Brazil will wipe out our agriculture, and it's not just sugar. Other countries will capture the market share, our agricultural capacity will be developed into real estate, housing and so forth. How horrible, building homes for people to live in. And then we lose our capacity to produce our own food, at which point we're at the mercy of a foreign country for our food security. What are the specifics of the policy that Senator Rubio is trying to defend here? Well, government support for the U.S. sugar industry has existed in some form since 1789. But, as Scott Lincecum writes in his critique of our sugar policy, there are currently 4 main pillars. First, there are price support loans. Sugar producers can get government loans from the USDA by putting their sugar up as collateral. They can either pay back the loan with interest, or they can default and hand over their sugar crop if the price goes below a certain point. How the government avoids widespread defaults is the second pillar, market allotments. The USDA determines how much sugar can be imported into the United States from other countries. In order to keep the price high, the USDA limits the importation tightly. In fact, the current law says that, at a minimum, 85% of the sugar market has to be produced domestically. The third pillar of sugar policy is a government purchasing program, wherein the USDA buys sugar and sells it, at a loss, to ethanol producers. Again, the USDA does this to keep the prices artificially high. And finally, the last pillar is import quotas. The USDA limits how much sugar can come in from any country duty-free. Once that threshold is passed, a very high tariff is slapped on the sugar, making it effectively unaffordable for domestic consumers, so no one actually bothers to import past that point. All of this in the name of national security. The one foreign nation that was exempt from these rules was Mexico under the original NAFTA agreement. However, that too was eventually ended. As Lincecum writes, the United States closed that loophole in 2015 with a good old trade remedy investigation and subsequent U.S.-Mexico suspension agreement that restricts Mexican sugar imports and keeps U.S. prices high. This change was codified into a formal agreement when NAFTA was renegotiated into the USMCA. This, of course, is wonderful and sort of scary at the same time. For years, we were getting affordable sugar from Mexico. Who knows what horrible things could have happened? We really dodged a bullet there, folks. So, how much does this cost American taxpayers? Well, according to a paper published by the American Enterprise Institute, if we eliminated the entire sugar program, we would have lower sugar prices and thus generate $5.3 billion in annual benefits we're currently not enjoying. Obviously, higher sugar prices mean that the commodity itself is more expensive. But since sugar is used in so many things, that means all of those products are more expensive as well. This is to say nothing of the non-financial costs of the program, one of which we'll be discussing later in this video. So who benefits from these generous government programs? Not consumers, that's for sure. They're the ones who pay those higher prices and whose tax dollars go to finance those generous government loans. No, the ones who benefit from this program are just a handful of large corporations, as the U.S. sugar industry is heavily concentrated in just a few large companies. Sugar barons like the billionaire Fanjul brothers, Alfonso and Jose, are the ones who gain the most from the U.S. sugar program. They also throw tons of cash around in their home state of Florida, including to people like Senator Marco Rubio, who then goes on to say that sugar subsidies are a matter of national security. Maybe he'd say those things anyways, and the support from the Fanjuls just happens to coincide with what he already believes. Or maybe he's doing their bidding because they write him campaign checks. I'll leave that for you to decide. Lest you think this is a one-off, similar dynamics exist in other sectors of the agricultural industry and other industries within the country. The sugar program just happens to be one particularly egregious example of this. It's a pretty consistent pattern, though. Corporate welfare is how the United States does economic nationalism. The government partners with big business to make things domestically, and you're worse off for it. If you're supporting economic nationalism, you're necessarily supporting corporate welfare, because that's pretty much always the mechanism by which it's achieved. But, as I said earlier, the costs of economic nationalism aren't just financial. As it happens, in the case of sugar, our domestic programs have probably made us less safe overall. Kim Iversen had a more recent monologue where she was railing against New Zealand's proposed cigarette ban. She correctly pointed out that prohibition typically leads to violent black markets.
So basically, prohibition in all of its forms has given rise to the mafia, the Klan, cartels, gangs, and the modern penal system of incarcerating millions of people. I'd say prohibition hasn't just been a failure, it's been a complete and total disaster.
That is demonstrably true. It happened with alcohol prohibition, and it has happened today with our current war on drugs. Cartel violence has devastated parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, and our disastrous war on drugs is part of it. That's not the only factor, of course. There's actually another federal policy that has contributed to this, and that policy is the sugar program. Given that sugarcane farmers in these areas have limited access to the U.S. market, many have decided to shift production to different crops, including illegal ones. As Douglas A. Irwin writes in Clashing Over Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy, the sharp reduction in sugar imports led to foreign policy problems. The quotas reduced export earnings and damaged the economies of Caribbean and Central American countries at a time when many of them were struggling with the global debt crisis and even fighting communist-backed insurgencies. The U.S. move hurt relations with these countries, and so the United States tried to help them with other trade preferences, such as the Caribbean Basin Initiative of 1983. The sugar quotas also led farmers in the region to stop producing sugar and cultivating illegal narcotics that were smuggled into the United States, starting a war with drug traffickers. Since they couldn't sell their legitimate crops to paying customers, they decided to switch to a much more profitable and much more dangerous crop that they could sell outside of the law. So not only is the sugar program a giant corporate welfare scheme, it's also contributed to multiple problems that affect other countries to our south, which of course inevitably affects us. So people can paint these what-if scenarios about what could potentially happen if we trade with people in other nations, but they very rarely consider the other side of the ledger, what it costs us by refusing to do so. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. The folly of economic nationalism goes a lot deeper than this. Stay tuned and have a Happy New Year.